There's just a couple more things that we're going to do before we wrap up this section on Symfony and start to look at how these components are used within Drupal 8. The first thing we're going to do is kind of a small thing, but it can illustrate how to involve several of the concepts that we've talked about so far. The idea is that right now, if we look at our leap year controller, I'm going to jump over to it in my editor. We're duplicating a bit of code here by creating our response object for different strings that we would pass to it. This also limits our ability to modify this response during the instantiation of it. For example, if we wanted to pass a particular status code or some other parameter to the response object every time that we create it, we'd have to go and edit it every place that we instantiate it in our controllers. So instead, it might make a little bit more sense to route the creation of the response to just one place, and instead just return strings as part of our response here. And the way we can do this is by adding a listener or a subscriber to say, hey, whenever we go and we're about to create our response, let's check to see if it's a response already. If it's not, and it's a string, we'll go ahead and create the response then. I'm going to jump to the resource pack directory, and I'll open up the 65th step, which is called adding the ability to return string. Now there's a couple of files that will need to be adjusted for this, so it's not going to work right off the bat. Let's copy this code and paste it over the code in our current leap year controller file and save it. Now you can see that we're returning strings now instead of response objects. Okay, let's go back to our resource pack. And let's create our string response listener.php file by copying step 66 here. So I'll copy it, and then I'll jump over to our examples folder and paste it in. And I'm going to rename it string response listener. Now we should be able to figure out just by opening up in the editor where it should be located. You see the namespace is simplex, so this should exist in our source simplex folder. But if you jump to the resource pack directory, you can look at the instructions in step 67 just to make sure that that's where it needs to go. Okay, so let's move that. I'm going to go back to our examples folder, and we'll drag string response listener over to simplex. So now if we look at the code for our string response listener, you can kind of get a sense for how it works. There will be a couple pieces in here that you don't really know where they're coming from, but we'll take a look anyway and identify the parts that we haven't covered already. So we're creating a class, string response listener, and we're implementing event subscriber interface. We've done this before. We're creating a function called onView. Now you've already seen this other function, get subscribed events, so we know that we're dealing with a subscriber here instead of a listener, and the event that we're listening for is kernel.view. Now this is an event that's provided by Symfony by default. If you're curious where this comes from, you can just do a search through the files in your examples folder. I'm going to jump back over to ours here, and I'll do a search for kernel.view, and it's here, kernel-events.php. You can see that it's in the HTTP kernel component inside of Symfony. And if you look through here, you can see kernel.view here, and there's an explanation as to what triggers this, and all of the other events that are supplied by the kernel are also listed here, along with a description of when and why these events fire. So if you're curious what else you can plug into, this is where you want to go. All right, back to our string response listener. So we're going to run the onView method, which is what we were looking at here. OnView takes one parameter. It's an object of the type getResponseForControllerResultEvent, which is pretty long. You can see that this is defined inside of our event component. So this is basically going to allow us to run setResponse, which will set the response for this controller. We first are going to grab the response. If it's a string, we're going to set the response to a new response object. So this will allow us to support controllers responding with a response, or they can just respond with a string, and we'll set the response here. And that's all that this listener does. Now, in order to get this listener to fire, we need to add it as a subscriber. So we'll adjust our front.php file, and we can do that here in step 68, adding string response listener. Go ahead and copy this code and paste it over the code in your front.php file and save it. If we compare this with our previous front.php file, we'll compare it with step 63 here. I'm going to drag this over to our file comparison tool. You can see we simply removed our examples from our last step and added a new subscriber, Simplex String Response Listener, which is what we just created. At this point, we now return strings from our controller, and we've added a new subscriber in our front controller that will use a class that we've just created that will grab the response object, and if it's just a string, it will convert it to a response object and return that back. So let's see if this works just by going to our browser and refreshing. Yep, this is a leap year. So it looks like everything's working